I was once told that my writing was like jazz, that it felt like jazz. This bit of feedback came from Semisonic drummer and nonfiction author Jacob SLICHTER, and it has been one of my favorite forms of feedback I ever received. But my work wasn't always like what it is now. It used to be forced, rigid, and consistently obvious as failed attempts to conform to an idea of what I was told film had to be, and subsequently what film music had to be. My work became jazz-like because I stopped what I was doing, took several years off to soul search, and finally found my voice as a writer and a filmmaker. Upon discovering what I could achieve by creating more authentic work, I discovered that my collaborations with jazz musician LYNDOL DESCANT is absolutely the perfect solution when it comes to matching music with the pictures I create. In this process video for Fractals, I talk with LYNDOL as we reflect on the project and the process of scoring.
Anyway, I watched a few of the process videos. I kind of have an idea of how it goes.
Well, those were just because it was me. Now you are in these, and so they're going to go much differently.
Well, there you go.
I figured
a lot of it was over my head. I couldn't follow a lot of the technical stuff, but it was good to hear the sound editing side of things, like just hear more about that process. It was cool. And I wanted to mention that's where I might have done overkill on some scenes. You know, I might have done too much and my stuff could just be completely silenced because I didn't always hear the sound design. I think how it's going to be, you know.
Yeah, that was always going to be like a little bit of a dance, just because it's the three of us. It's you, me, and Scott doing everything in post-production, and I mean everything. We had no one else, and so it was impossible for him to hear your music at the same time he was doing the pre-mix on all my sound design, and for you to hear the sound design because I was kind of doing it all at the same time. So it'll be very fun to watch, I think. But I've already told Scott, and I'll probably have another meeting with him. Scott, for those of you who don't know, is my sound mixer for this film, and he's also done some visual effects. I'm like, if it sounds better with sound design, lower the music. If it sounds better with music, bring it up. Let the scene dictate.
One of the concepts I was playing around with was sort of consistent audio cues with certain things. And so that may or may not play well with the audio design. So those things specifically, like the dream sequences, I brought in a certain thing. Once I did it in the earlier sequences, I felt like it was important to keep that consistent in case you wanted it, but it's entirely optional. You know what I mean? It's entirely, because especially like when one of the little things I heard really the dream sequence and I heard the sounds a little bit better and it was like, oh yeah, I don't know that we need that. There was some other different audio cues. You know, I really tried to play with keeping certain things consistent throughout the whole film. And so those are the kind of things that, you know, if we had been more involved right then and there, I could have said, do you want this or not? Or, oh, you're going to do that here. But since it was more like, just go for it, the idea would be overkill, just leave it out, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think with this project too, like that, well, because a lot of this is going to end up being perceived by the public, I feel like I should give some background. When we did Death in Life, which is our first collaboration together, I almost felt like I undershot it. And everything was sort of like less than maybe would have been ideal. I limited myself to 2 takes on everything, as few locations as possible, as few days as possible. With Fractals, it was the complete opposite, which makes a lot of sense because it's the opposite film. I overshot it. I ended up cutting almost an hour out after the first assembly. And it makes sense, too, that I would also overdo the sound design. I would overdo every component of it. And music is no exception. We overdid the music, and that's fine, too. It's this is part of the process. And these are, you know.
Yeah, I gotcha. Yeah.
But
Well, and for me, it was different because with Death in Life, I really loved what I did, which was to just sit down, improvise to scenes, and then edit from there. And so the concept that you had come to me with was the idea of taking this one song, No Sense, and then building it out throughout the film in a lot of different ways. And that's the concept that stayed in my head, even though a year later, when I actually got into composing for it, it was over a year later when I started composing. The music cues were quite different than what I had envisioned myself, having a year to sort of imagine. I had sort of more imagined building out No Sense in a lot of different ways, like folky here and this here. And there was an overall string and dramatic and much more cinematography type of sound to it than I had anticipated. But I still brought in that concept of using No Sense for the inspiration behind a lot of those themes. And so I still stuck with that. I sort of never could quite get away with that, even though you gave me a little bit more leeway when the project came, down to kind of, if you want to stray from that, it doesn't have to stay as centralized around that theme. But I went ahead and did that anyways. And so even in the smallest little spots where I was composing something, it was still within the realm of the chord changes of No Sense. Sometimes there was key changes from there, but it was still all somewhat centered around No Sense. And that was more difficult to just, I wanted to just sit out and purely compose when I would get a sequence. I mean, that was what I wanted to do. And I did it in certain cases, but there was more parameters on it. And then there was the long-term goal of keeping it consistent without doing overkill on it. You know what I mean? Without it being too repetitive. And that was from day one, the challenge for me, like facing it, like, how do I keep this theme consistent without it being sort of just monotonous and repetitive? And I didn't know how I was going to do it. And that's what's so fun about this project. It was like, I really didn't know if or how I was going to be able to do it. And I just had to show up every day and spend the time with the film. And in many cases, it was still that pure getting outside of my own head, improvising, being in the moment with the film that brought that about. And that's the funnest part of the creative process, is sort of being surprised yourself by the results that come out.
And I remember, like, when we first started talking about it, and I first started talking about it with a bunch of people, the goal was always, I want to be surprised by this movie when it's done. If I'm not surprised by it, I probably won't be able to live with it. And that's sort of my rule, is I want to create something that I can't really anticipate. I can plan for lots of things, but in the end, Fractals is not 100% the movie I could have predicted. Like, it's got all the elements, but there's a vibe that was created out of just having it not 100% be what we envisioned initially. But that was always part of the process. Like, I knew that things were going to change. I didn't know a pandemic was going to happen and that I would lose all my main cast, but that's okay too. I found great people. But you were talking about No Sense. I think I should probably give a background about that song, since this is kind of where we're going to introduce the song to people. No Sense is a song written by a really fabulous songwriter named Eric Anderson, he lives in Maine. I've known this song since the late 90s because a musician by the name of Jeff Cusack used to perform it at a restaurant where I was a cook. And I'm like, I really dig this song. What is this song? And he told me it was written by one of his neighbors. And I'm like, this is fabulous. And Jeff eventually put it on his album. He put out an album called Punt. And that's the only version of the song I ever knew. And I would play it for you in this, but I have yet to get permission from Jeff. I asked him for permission to use it in this video, but he hasn't gotten back to me. But it really is legitimately one of my favorite songs, and I've always wanted to take it and root an entire score in this song. But I never knew really which project it would be. And then Fractals came along, and I finally got the courage up to call up Eric Anderson at his home in Maine. And I'm like, here's kind of what I want to do. And we talked for about an hour. He didn't remember writing the song. Apparently, he was a teenager or maybe a young adult of some. He was young, and he wrote many songs apparently. And he, I said, all right, well, can I use it? He said, yeah, sure, do whatever you want, have at it. I'm like, great. And so the whole score you're creating is kind of rooted in his masterpiece. And eventually, when I sent him the teaser trailer that we put out right after we shot, where Tim is singing it a cappella, Eric emailed me and he said, I remember this now. Okay, yeah, this works perfectly and it's so beautiful. I can't wait to see the thing. And so now he has yet to hear your vocal rendition of it. He's heard your little test because you did a little bit of test with the keyboard or a piano, which we also used in the trailer. So that's all he heard. He heard your little test that you did and some of Tim's a cappella. So I'm really looking forward to having him hear the whole movie and what you did with it.
Things don't make sense as time slips by. I'd be okay if I could cry. Think of your face, makes me dream. Be okay if I could scream. Cling to your thoughts, what's been said doesn't help. You're in my head, in my head.
That's so cool. That's such a good story. And it really is a good song. I mean, and I've had it. So you came to me in January 2020. We talked through the movie. You introduced this song to me. I think I spent a little bit of time with it, maybe in February, changing keys, playing through some improv on it, sent those to you. And then that's what marinated in the back of my brain for like a year. Right. And I'm kind of like this, like songs go in and sometimes it's like in the back, they're better when they sit there for a little while with me. Even if I'm not actively playing them all the time or singing them all the time, there's something about the passage of time. Then when I go back to it, it's almost like I'm more intimate with it or I know it better. It's interesting how it works. I've never been able to, as a music teacher, I've always sort of like watched this process happen. And so I think that ended up being really good for me, that it was sitting there in the back of my brain like that for a year rather than going straight into working with it and composing with it. The timing getting displaced because of the pandemic, I think it served because there was times when it was coming out almost subconsciously as I was scoring, the little licks, the little movements of certain things. And that was partially what surprised me, because towards the end of the film, it was like, oh, could you try to bring in no sense with this theme here? And then I go back and I realized I had already done that. It was just very subtly in the bass line or, very subtly here or there. So I think that the process ended up working really well for me. Because I wasn't always just consciously thinking, do it, bring out a piece from no sense and build it out, but it was there. It was just all the time there in my mind. And it really affected my creativity, even in my improvisations. And I think it works well with the fractal theme, even though I didn't think this through at the time, but it's sort of like the whole, and then the whole being expressed and even in the parts, even if it seems so different from the whole. Right. That was one of the ways that I think the fractal theme ended up sort of marinating as well and coming out and affecting my creative process, because that was part of why I was so thrilled to be part of this. I've always loved the idea of fractals. And I think I read this book a long time ago, Holographic Universe, and just got really into the idea. And so that's always been in the back of my brain too. Even though I wasn't consciously always thinking of it, those ideas were there and they were stirred up by the dialogue and stirred up by things happening in the movie. As I was watching it. So I think that kind of worked out really well. And I still love the song No Sense. I've spent a lot of time with it at this point, and I'm excited to still create yet another version, to bring it all together.
Yesterday you were talking really beautifully about the whole fractals concept, because yesterday was kind of our last really real meeting for this, because we're done for the most part.
So post-production.
Yeah, the final mix is on its way, and I really, really appreciated hearing that you talk about that scene with Tim where he finally starts talking about fractals in the middle of the movie, and you even remembered it was sequence 5. I didn't remember that, and because it's so foggy to me, and it's just like, oh yeah, I'm not alone in this. I feel like I'm alone in this, but like 2 other people are living through all these sequences, and they're memorizing all where what falls, and because there's 7 reels to this thing, and that's a lot. That's a lot for a 2 hour and 9 minute film. 7 reels.
And it's a lot of music.
Oh yeah.
As we've spoken of, it's a lot of music, and that was part of the, how do you keep it interesting? How do you keep it fresh? But also how is it a coherent musical story? That was a real challenge for me. I likened it to like writing a short story versus like writing a full-length book, which I've tried to do before. And it's tricky because by the time you get to the end, you've kind of forgotten what happened in the beginning. And like, it's just really, it's a constant process to keep the sequences fresh in your mind, but also come to them from a new place, bring in new things, try to think of the movie the way the audience would be seeing it for the first time when you've seen it, so many times. You're starting to, I was quoting back lines to you yesterday because I find there to be a lot of quotable lines. But when we got to that sequence where he actually does talk about the fractals in 5, this is where I was like, I really want this music to reflect fractals. How do I do that?
The fractal, a curve or geometric figure, each section with the same statistical character as the whole. Fractals are useful in modeling structures, such as eroded coastlines or snowflakes, in which similar patterns recur at progressively smaller scales, and in describing partly random or chaotic phenomena such as crystal growth, turbulence, and galaxy formation. Could the fractal be the recurring clue to the nature of the universe? To us? To our purpose? To the yet-to-be-accepted truth that we have no purpose? The proof that we're nothing more than a subroutine in the simulation that is reality?
And on top of that, it couldn't just be an interesting concept, like, oh, cool, she kind of like, composed with this idea of fractalization in mind. It had to actually just be a cool piece of music. So that's what I wasn't sure. And I was like, I'm going to go into this with a pure experimental idea, which was basically taking, 4 measures here and laying that with that exact measure squanched in time inside of it. And it worked. I couldn't believe it when it actually worked. I was like, that sounds so cool. And it was like, if I was just trying to make it sound cool, I couldn't have probably made it sound as cool as that, but it does reflect that fractalization idea that these little parts, these measures here reflect the full 4 measures here. And then I took that idea and I kept building out after that because it worked so well there. I used it more in other places. And then I even went back and used it in other places before that, hinting here and there, places where I could slow the tempo here, but then speed it up here and it worked, or just, those sort of ideas. And to me, like, that was just, I was so excited. I couldn't wait to send it to you when that happened, because I was like, yes, this is like exactly, to me, that is the very heart of the film, that scene. And I feel like the music, reflects that depth of that concept, and also like the heart of the movie and the human side to the movie as well. And I felt really, pleased with that particular piece. And then just before this, I thought, I'm going to just like look into fractalization. And I realized that there's actually been a lot of composers that have done this very thing, trying to express fractalization. And in some ways, I'm excited I didn't research that first and then just use a concept. Like, I came to it from my own problem solving, methods and my own creative process. But it's interesting to see, using ratios, using all kinds of different things, how, fractalization being expressed auditorily is actually not anything new. You know, it's kind of, a lot of composers have tackled that issue, and it's being employed in a lot of music that we hear. So,
But yeah, I can imagine that it must feel so super amazing to come up on your own accord and then with this idea and then realize, wait a minute, all the greats are doing it. You know? It's the best ego stroke.
yeah, there you go. There you go. But, you know, I think that's important because I think both you and I are the type of artists that we want to we want to develop our own voice. We want to develop our own sound. And it can be tempting to just go and see, like, what did the greats do, and then do that. You know, it's a trap that creatives can fall in.
Oh, yeah.
And it can feel good that way, but it's a little bit more vulnerable and scary to go the other way, the inside out way. And to me, that was something I learned from this. But I wanted it to be that way. Like, I wanted to be that vulnerable with this. I wanted to take risks with it because I feel like it's the film warrants it. As I mentioned, it's such an authentic film. And I was so, even though I was daunted by the task of how much music and how to really work such, you know, depth of dialogue and all these things, I was so thankful for the challenge and the creative space to be able to do that. Because for me, it's like a project, you know, just a dream project to be able to do that. You know, as musicians, when we're dealing with projects, a lot of times there's much more, you know, dictating to our creative process of how to do it, a lot more like, do it this way, you know, a lot more of, you know, and you can get into formulas and you can sort of get more efficient with your time that way. But I really went the opposite way with this and just thought, I'm just going to sit here with this film. And even if I go the wrong direction and then have to double back this way and I'm not going to be so worried about the amount of time I'm spending on it. I just want it to be coming from that true place of authenticity, because that's what's going to match the film. And so when you do that, you don't know if it's going to work out. You know, you are, as Nora Jones says, when she gets on stage, she said, every night it's a risk. You know, you just don't know. But because if you're really taking those risks, then you don't know how it's going to turn out. And for me, it's thrilling and exciting to take those kind of risks, be that humble, and then feel like, you know, what ended up coming out for me is greater than what I think I could have done on my own. It was somewhat an act of faith that it would all come together. And we're still in that process. It's still a bit of an act of faith because we haven't seen the final project yet. But it's so exhilarating and it's so exciting, and it's such a feeling of being alive. And I have to think that the audience will feel those feelings as well, because they're authentic, you know?
Yeah, I'm optimistic that the people who need to see it will experience what we've done. And you know, you will always have people who won't, you know, it just is what it is. But so yeah. Like, I'm hearing some similar stuff from Scott as well, where like there's something about the authenticity of the concept that immediately clicked him into gear with wanting to do this film. He even offered to do the visual effects just because I needed help, because it's not like a project that really imitates anything. Like, there's of course some imitation within, because what I know of movies, I know from watching movies, right? But overall, I can't think of a movie like it. I could think of a million movies like Death and Life. Even though that's still like a rare kind of movie to see, especially nowadays when people are really hardcore able to imitate Hollywood. But that thing is so inspired by the French New Wave that if you were to go on a binge watching French New Wave, you'd be like, oh, this is Death and Life. Like, I get it. But Fractals, I don't have anything to compare it to.
The only thing the only reference I can come up, and this isn't really a good perfect reference, but it's at least similar, is Richard Linklater. You remember him?
Mm-hmm.
Some of the dialogue reminds me of that. And we haven't really had movies in the mainstream since him. Maybe you could say Woody Allen movies used to be, maybe, but interesting dialogue, just in-depth, interesting dialogue that's talking through philosophical ideas. That's the closest, and that's a small fraction of what this movie is, right? But that part did come to mind when I was watching it. I was like, oh, because I'm from Austin too, and I was like, oh, I like this, I dig this. It's been a while since I've seen a movie like that.
Yeah, I don't really think that much about Richard Linklater when I think about film, but he's definitely one of those filmmakers where, like, if I'm watching it, I'm always just listening to people talk, and it's beautiful dialogue because, and I'm thinking immediately when I think of him, I always think of Slacker, and then his follow up about those high schoolers who are just going to, it's like set in one night, and they're just driving around Texas.
Wait,
What was
is
the name of that
one-
movie?
Oh, am I forgetting that movie?
Dazed and Confused.
Yes.
So those are the two movies I think of when I think of him, and there's nothing about any of the dialogue of those movies that drive the story forward. All that dialogue to me is just how people talk, and that's kind of like, to me, the perfect model for how to write a screenplay, how to write screenplay dialogue.
Yeah.
I mean, there's this guy in Slacker who's going around trying to hawk some famous Madonna's. I forget what it's called. I feel so stupid right now. But like he's got like Madonna's pap smear results or something, and he's trying to like sell it on the streets to somebody who's willing to pay for it, and it's just like it's the weirdest thing to base a film around, and that's the kind of stuff I really dig. But yeah,
Well,
it's
and
an
I don't-
honor to be
I don't even
compared
know.
to him.
Well, and that's the comparison, that the only one that came to mind, even though, like I said, that's a small part. The dialogue is a small piece of this bigger film that you made. But I especially appreciated it because I feel like we're living in a time period where people are having a harder time having just real dialogue with each other, just really people speaking their minds about things. And it was very heartening and really wonderful to see that, just somebody really, having discussions and thinking through things that were on their mind. It was really nice. And I think it's maybe could inspire people for those type of dialogues. Maybe and people are having them more in private than we realize, but I think it's so good and healthy for all of us to have the freedom to speak out our thoughts, whether we agree or not about things. And I thought that the movie captured that really well in a lot of the scenes, and I enjoyed watching that. And it was heartening. There was a lot of things in the movie that for me were just like, yes, like this is something that we, is just so right, spot on to hear somebody say right now, or have somebody experience. There were so many things I personally could relate to it. I've always been a bit of an odd duck, though. I know that I'm a bit of a creative. So, this is, for me, this goes out to, those other people out there, those creatives that, need that sort of understanding that you're not creating alone, even if we are. And I appreciated that you gave me a lot of space for my creative process. It would have been different if you were like checking in all the time and trying to see what I was doing. You gave me so much space, and I appreciated that. But on another level, we were working together, working through the same things, talking through the same things. And that spirit of community really came. It was nice. It was really supportive for me.
Yeah, I didn't even send you that many notes. I think the most notes I sent you might have been up to 7 for one reel, but most of them were like just one or two things.
Yeah.
And that's how you know you have the right collaborators. Because
Well, yeah.
yeah,
I didn't know if you were just going easy on me, but it's good to hear that you were, really were just jiving with all of it. And that's part of the it being a dream project for me, because really you really do expect to, get your stuff weed whacked on a certain level. And that's just part of that's just part of the job, and you do it. But it was so refreshing and so nice. And then it emboldened me to go forward with my creative ideas rather than trying to anticipate what you would want. And that also blew the doors open on my creativity, And so you're like such a wonderful director to work with.
So you you worked on this for over a year, mostly during the pandemic, and you did some of it in Texas and some of it in New Jersey. That's great. It's a worldly film.
Yeah.
Even though it's a New York film at its heart, it's still a worldly film.
And it was interesting because there was a certain point where I was sort of I needed to come, my boyfriend needed to come back to New Jersey, but I was thinking about staying in Texas and just going deep in it for 1 month and then catching back up with him. Cause I didn't want to I had a pretty good studio set up down there. I almost thought somehow it would disrupt my creative process. And I'd maybe done 3 sequences at that point. And I just thought the moving up, it could displace all of it. And I'm really glad that I didn't do that. I'm really glad that I went this direction, even though I think in some ways, like we talked about, the logistics of keeping all the pieces together might have been easier if I had been able to just shut the world out, been entirely isolated for 1 month and just work day and night on it. But the pandemic kind of taught me that, family is important, people are important, having a balanced and healthy lifestyle is important. So I took the risk and I thought, I want to be with my boyfriend. There's other things that I need to do as well. And I'm going to do it. I'm going to figure out a way and I'm going to do it. And it was so cool. It was so cool that the process ended up being that way, because in reality, there was a level of patience that had to happen. And there was also a level of I'd give so much of my creative energy to it that I don't even think that I could have done like a 24/7 type of binge on it. It was much more like, this is what came out. And then it took patience in focusing over here, and why I did that, other ideas solidified or other things came in. And the only thing that I really had to do for that process to work so perfectly, and I would always sort of light up, I'd feel green, like, okay, now I'm ready for this. I've got these ideas. And then I'd watch it and then I'd be like, I'm not ready. And I'd go and do all this other stuff, and then green light, come back. And this pacing that I did with the workflow on it was just incredible. It was so healthy. It was such a healthy, balanced way to also feel like these creative ideas were there for me whenever the time was right. And also it built my faith, because I remember there being one point where I was talking to a friend about it, and just sort of, there was a fear like it wasn't going to come together. And that was the part that wanted to just do it, just get in there and just get it all done and see if it's going to work or not. And there had to be this other level of faith of like, I'm going to let go. I'm going to just let go. I'm not going to know how all the parts are going to come together. I'm just going to focus on my little part. And then have faith that the whole will work out. And so that built so many muscles in me about my own creative process and my own ability to just trust the process, and to be able to work and let go and work and let go. I think it actually does create some of the most inspiring type of content, because there's not that fear and control underneath.
All right. I mean, we have some good stuff here, and I think we should unpack this more in a podcast, because I think this would make a good podcast as well.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, these process videos just give people a taste of what we kind of went through these past year and how the film came together, because I think it's a different kind of independent film. It's definitely it's got a lot of production value for a film that had no budget.
But the thing I like about it, Eric, is I think another way you can expand the fractal thing is that I feel like even in my teaching, almost everything I've done as an artist has been about me developing my own voice, and in large part to inspire other people to develop their own voice. Because I guess I've always had that idea that if each of us is doing all we can, then a lot of the bigger issues will just get resolved that way. We'll sort of like a mosaic if we each step up into our piece. And I think a lot of people aren't necessarily reaching their full potential, or they're too scared to use their voice. And so it's a lot about trying to inspire others. And this film is just spot on with that. You know what I mean? This is just so in line with, I think, something that both of us have always sort of shared, is this desire to do our thing and then encourage other people to do their thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing with the arts, especially in the United States, where there's not enough people willing to take the leap into authenticity. I mean, there's a conformity, and I get that. For 15 straight years, I was trying to conform my work to expectations, and it never worked. And can I ask you a question? How long have you been submitting to? Because when we initially met, you'd submitted to a call for a composer. How long before that were you doing that in New York?
I don't remember. I mean, when was that? Like, I think it was like 2017 when we worked
20
on Death.
2016.
2016. Okay. Yeah, I'd been doing it for a while by that point. I mean, probably since 2010, but not as, the thing is, I've always performed as well. I've also always put out my own music. I've been teaching, and especially in New York, I was hustling. So it's not like I was doing it like every day. And that was one of the things that always went into like, am I just not doing it enough? But I have been doing it since that time.
Well, I was thinking about it because when we were talking about authenticity and whatnot, and how I wasn't really all that authentic for through my 20s and early 30s. I remember you submitting to some of my composer calls before then.
Oh, really?
And I thought, I don't know if this would work, if the style coincides with what I'm attempting. And the moment I cut loose, I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to throw it all out there and see what happens. That's when suddenly your style and my style seemed to work well.
That is, see,
Isn't that
so
really interesting? Because because you submitted it several times for several projects, it never worked out, and then with this Death in Life project, it worked out so perfectly that now we did fractals, and it all just came down to not conforming and just doing something differently. I don't know what it was. It's just, I always hear filmmakers talk about, oh, it's the perfect recipe. This was the perfect recipe. This is collaboration.
I think it makes sense if you get into the idea that everything is vibration, which as a musician, of course, I think about a lot. But it's like a lot more things I think match on levels that we're not even conscious of or not. You know what I mean? And it's interesting to just hear your perspective on it, because you've never told me that you got other submissions from me first. So that's interesting. I guess I have been doing it a long time. But I just, for me, this was such a meaningful project. And that's where I'd like to spend my time, because it's become clear you can't do it all. You know what I mean? Like you have to sort of be able to, I personally have so much creative energy, and I really want to put it towards things that I believe in, that are authentic. And so, having this project this last year has been a real blessing for me, and I'm thankful. And I don't know what's going to happen, going forward. It's sort of like, it's been so nice to have this. It's been like my friend this whole time, for months. And now we're kind of stepping into a new world. But going forward, I want to continue to stay. I'm more convinced than ever that this is the type of projects that I want to spend my time on.
Same.
So thanks, Eric. Because you helped me. There was some dark moments for me, and you were there for me, helping me kind of just, just start creating, just get back on the horse and start creating. So.
Yeah. I mean, that's it. When in doubt, just go into the studio and throw some paint, fling some paint and see where it lands, It's my philosophy.
It works.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Lyndol.
You're welcome, Eric.
Bye.
Bye.